Hello, YouTube. Just making a quick response to Theo Warner's video, Theo and Philosophy. Um, I agree, more or less. I think that philosophy should impact my life, or it's useless unless it can impact my life. I think that can happen in perhaps a wider breadth of ways um, than than Theo does. It seems. Karl Marx had that famous line: "Philosophers have just tried to describe the world. The point is to change it." And agree with Marx or not, he certainly changed the world. Have pointed to, there is no thinker besides perhaps Jesus who more effectively changed the world than Karl Marx. So that's one sense within which I can say someone changed the world. Theodor Adorno, as a writer, changed music, specifically avant-garde music, and how people thought about that. That is also something of a value, and that's, understanding Adorno's position on music is something that I've worked very hard to think about and internalize to a certain degree. And in that sense, it's been, a project in Mike. Theo refers to his philosophical interests as being projects in Theo. Adorno's aesthetics and other aspects of it too have been a large part of the project of Mike, right? There's also, Kierkegaard defines philosophy as the ability to make the movements of doubt. And I think in this sense, philosophy is probably at its best, at its most useful. I think when we start to interact with the philosophical tradition, we begin by realizing that a lot of people had a lot of the same ideas that we have about the world, just sort of common sense things, common sense aspects of the world. How do we know things and stuff like that? What is the case? What constitutes that which is the case, etc. And we also find pretty quickly the next step is that those presuppositions don't work. And we end up with new propositions, which then usually in turn don't work either. So philosophy is at its best, I think in this way, when the floor starts to fall out beneath you and your thought. That means that you're getting somewhere, I think, in philosophy. But that's useful in terms of the arguments that people make. But it's also that philosophy is at its most useful when it's a practice. And through the understanding of the movements of doubt and how that works and how that happens, I think that we begin to be able to look at problems in our lives in a much more rich way, in a much more diverse way. Some problems that I encounter in life simply dissolve because I've developed a certain conception of language. I begin to see a lot of claims that people make as being naive, you know what I mean? And this interaction with integral math and authorial intent is a great example. Like, what he's saying is something, it's a naive proposition that is very intuitive, you know. It's the kind of thing that somebody would say before actually looking into the subject and before actually reading about the subject. That's important, because, you know, if he did go so far as to look through the history of the philosophy of language and literary criticism, you know, he'd find out very quickly that it doesn't work. What he's doing doesn't work, and to summarize that in a response in YouTube videos is challenging in and of itself, but in some way, perhaps the argument from authority here is the most effective, to say that, like, people have, you know, not entirely, you know, but people have dropped the notion of authorial intent as being the definitive answer for literary criticism. That notion has been criticized, and it's sort of fallen apart, and there are reasons for that, and there are good reasons for that. And again, I would point anybody to reading someone like Jacques Derrida. Foucault talks about this in The Archaeology of Knowledge, which is his only book on methodology. Etc. There are 1,000 different ways that you can destabilize this presupposition, and it has been destabilized, is the point. And so an interaction with the philosophical tradition sort of prevents you from making trite claims like that, and claims that, like, that don't work. You know, you learn to avoid claims that don't work, or at least to try and refigure them, or get around them, and, you know, etc. That's the core of what I think makes philosophy useful, is the development of a screen for filtering out naive bullshit, you know. But I think also there's value in you know, if you look at Hegel, Hegel's philosophy is huge. It's the breadth and the depth of the philosophy is like incomparable. It's majestic, and I think there's an aesthetic value in that. You know, I don't claim that Hegel's system works. I think he made a lot of good points. But it's valuable to understand exactly how big thought can get. It's valuable to understand Socrates and understanding how simple thought can get, and how effective that can be. Hegel also has this conception of philosophy, which I think is really important, and at least lays the groundwork for Marx, which is philosophy is it's a period in history articulated in thought. You know, the act of philosophy is to articulate your own period in history and thought. And I think that that's a good thing to do. You know, in other words, to understand the world around you. Howard Zinn makes something like the claim that if you don't understand history, then you're completely subservient. You know, you can't be a free agent. Anyone can tell you anything if you don't understand history, and you have no grounds with which to reject them. And I think this is also true in the absence of the Hegelian conception of thought. You know, I think it's true that anybody can tell you anything if you don't set about the serious work of understanding the world around you in a provisional way, you know. That's important. And I mean, yeah, those are the avenues within which I find thought most most compelling. And I don't think that this is where I would disagree with Theo, respectfully, is that I think decadent philosophy, as he defined it, which is philosophy that doesn't connect the subject to the world directly, or doesn't offer some kind of direct program for dealing with things. I think that the dealing with text in and of itself, and dealing with approach to text, and I've talked about before about the distinction between how someone thinks and what someone thinks. You know, the what someone thinks, in the sense that I'm talking about, is the least interesting part of understanding philosophy. The how someone thinks is always valuable. And I think, you know, even in reading what you might call a decadent philosopher, you can get something out of understanding how someone thinks. And again, you know, philosophy is at its best when it's at its most critical too. That's the other central thesis I want to make. This is why Nietzsche was such a genius. You know, he built his whole philosophy out of rigorous criticism. Derrida is another one. Socrates is another one. Just these people who just say, "Oh, that seems really obvious. Well, guess what? Like, here's why that doesn't work." Like, that skill is, and the ability to identify when something is too obvious, sort of, too common sense. The ability to understand when something is taken as given to the point where it becomes a hidden premise. You know, I don't even feel that I need to state this because it seems obvious. Those are the things that are most suspect. I think a reading of philosophy leads you to believe, or leads you to understand, that those things are the most suspect. Those are the things that tend to be the most indefensible. They also are usually the most easily criticizable. Again, like the issue of authorial intent. And it's fruitful to do that, because then we don't just end up living in a, you know, in a world where people just take things as given. This is the basis of critical thinking, or not the basis of it. It's the application of critical thinking, and the cultivation of how to do that. And I think that's something that can be learned from probably reading anyone, or you can learn something new about it from reading anyone. I'll put it that way. But oh man, I had one more point. I can't remember what it is. Well, I guess it's the response to the issue of philosophy and what's useful about philosophy. Oh, that's it. What interests me, what particular philosophers interest me, and why they interest me is another question that Theo kind of raises, and the answer is that I can't necessarily point to why certain thinkers influence me. I tend to have an appreciation for really literary writing, though. I like Foucault is the best example of this, probably. If you read the beginning of Discipline and Punish, that first chapter, he describes a few like medieval public executions, and it's the beginning of an analysis of the rise of the prison system. And he describes these medieval public executions just to show how quickly and how dramatically the notion of state punishment changed. But he writes it so well, and it's so beautiful. The order of things begins with a description of a painting, and that's also very beautiful. Foucault's prose is just really enjoyable, I think, and playful. Derrida has an extremely literary quality to him, too. He's horrible to try and make any sense out of. But I would read it, much in the same way that I would read poetry. I think he is, and I don't think that's a radical claim. For Derrida, I don't think there's a difference between prose and poetry. Nietzsche is a wonderful writer. Also, he's really easy to get into, and he makes these really dramatic claims. And Nietzsche loves hyperbole as a device. God is dead is the famous one. Like that. That's a hyperbolic statement, and Nietzsche knows that it's a hyperbolic statement, and that hyperbole has a purpose in his work in and of itself, and I just love. There's something so like engaging about the way he actually writes. Wittgenstein is another example of someone who has a very beautiful writing style. In some way, these things are what's necessary for me to become interested in something. I have to like enjoy reading it. I did some studies into Kant, which is fucking painful to read. Hegel's a little more poetic, but he's also very, very difficult. And you feel like you're just trudging through mud when you're reading them. Doesn't mean that they're not valuable, but like it's hard for me. I'm almost a little bit too ADD to I've read some of the phenomenology of the spirit, but that's how I do it. I took a class on Kant and Hegel in college, so I know their work as it is. But now when I go back and read things, I tend to read things in more excerpt form, just because I don't have the attention span to sit through it all. I'll put it that way. Adorno is painfully difficult too, but he's very poetic as well. So yeah, I hope that shed some light on what I think the role of philosophy is in the world, why it's important to me as a subject, and yeah, comment, subscribe. Hope this finds you well, and have a good day.